Hello everybody and welcome to my SAC 7103 presentation entitled Using a Constraints-Based Approach to Coaching the Single Leg Hip Hinge. The constraints-based approach is a model which helps us understand how individuals learn based upon the constraints they are in. The constraints-based approach is derived from both the ecological psychology and the dynamic systems theory. These three constraints, which are listed over here, so the organismic constraints, environmental constraints, and task constraints, interact together and determine how a performer performs based on the constraints and tasks given to them. Through self-organization processes and the human body and its various biological systems, constraints shape the emergence of movement patterns, understanding and decision-making processes, as stated by Renshaw and colleagues. As coaches, we must use these constraints to challenge athletes to manipulate their decision-making and movement strategies. Given the complexity of the interconnectedness of these systems, one small change in a part of a system can create a much larger global change in a movement pattern. Affordances and perception-action coupling. What are affordances? Affordances were described by Cole to be possibilities for actions. In his writing, Cole uses the example of what a person does when they are crossing the road and it is raining. When it is raining and the person is crossing the road and they meet a puddle on the crossing, they must decide whether they should just step over it, hop over it, skip, jump, go through it, or walk around it. These decisions that a person needs to make are all affordances. So these affordances are possibilities of these actions which we can take. Now, in a sports scenario, the environment around us is always changing. People are running, changing direction. If it is a ball game, a ball is involved. We have to interact with the ball, the environment, opponents, and teammates. So the environment is always changing, and we must decide which affordances we are going to use, so which decisions we are going to make to come up with the best solution for optimal sports performance. Now, these affordances are greatly influenced by dynamic and performance factors such as experience and body size. Now, affordances are one of the main focuses of the constraints-based approach. And these affordances can appear and disappear based on the training that an athlete performs and the environment that they are placed in on a daily basis, even during the training. Now, perception-action coupling occurs when a movement which is being performed provides further information for more movements to occur. Stoffrick and colleagues wrote that perception is an act and it depends on movement of the receptors, limbs, and the organism itself, so the person himself. The single leg hip hinge. The single leg hip hinge is a complex posterior chain dominant movement, which can be very useful in developing unilateral hip flexion and extension. Now, in athletic performance, in all athletic performances, hip flexion and extension are very important movement patterns which provide and produce many of the movements which occur in sports, such as running, jumping, hopping, skipping, and sprinting, and also changing direction. So, performing the single leg hip hinge outside of a competitive environment can have a massive carryover to the competitive environment. Now, given that the movement is performed unsupported and on one leg, a great deal of balance and core stability are also required to perform this movement. Therefore, by performing it, we are also training these factors. The single leg hinge can also be used as a training tool and screening tool to uncover any differences in mobility and strength between both limbs. Now, as we can see in this video, the athlete will start on one leg being supported by the other, hold his or her hands on the hips, and then hinge backwards. We can observe how the foot on the floor is very stable. Over here, this foot is very stable by grabbing the floor with her toes. The person then slightly bends her front knee and hinges back from the hips, keeping a neutral spine with the head, shoulders, hips, knees, and ankle being in a relatively straight line. Now, organismic constraints. Orgasmic constraints were described by Renshaw and colleagues in 2010 by being characteristics of an individual. These may include physical, psychological, physiological, and emotional factors. A person's morphological, physical abilities and state of mind can all affect the strategies that person uses to perform a given movement task. Orgasmic constraints are the factors which provide a person with affordances, and they determine the solution adopted by a person. For example, somebody with very good hip mobility might opt to use a less knee-dominant strategy when performing the single leg hip hinge, whereas somebody with poor hip mobility might opt to perform the single leg hip hinge with a more knee-dominant strategy. As strength and conditioning coaches, our main concern is with the physiological characteristic of orgasmic constraints. However, what we can work on Given our role as strength and conditioning coaches, we cannot change the anthropometrics of the athlete in front of us. However, we can work on certain physical characteristics such as mobility and strength imbalancements. It is also very important to note that we can manipulate orgasmic constraints by training a new skill such as the single leg hip hinge at the beginning of the training session. This is very important so that the central nervous system and the muscular system and neuromuscular systems are fresh and not fatigued, therefore a better learning curve will occur. Task constraints. Task constraints are constraints which are related to the goals of the given task. These constraints are the constraints which we can mostly manipulate in a gym setting. So, we must always keep in mind that before performing the unilateral hip hinge, we must ensure that the athlete is confident in performing the bilateral hip hinge. This is important because we must reduce the chance of having a lumbar spine overuse injury, because the single leg hip hinge the movement must occur at the hips, not at the spine. It is very important to note that in their writing, Guerin and Kunkel wrote that task constraints emerge and decay in nature. Renshaw and colleagues also wrote how, in an experiment by Chow and colleagues in 2005, they identified that constraints can increase or decrease in importance based on the participant's performance. In the given context, if an athlete is performing the unilateral hip hinge, when the athlete is confident in their ability to stay balanced on one leg, their focus would shift towards other task constraints such as keeping a neutral spine throughout the movement and not hinging from the spine but rather using the hips. Over time, Chow and colleagues identified that the tasks seemed to get easier for their participants and thus concluded that constraints on learning are not permanent and evolve or diminish on different timescales. To teach the single leg hip hinge, there are a wide variety of task constraints that can be manipulated in order to make achieving the desired outcome easier. Firstly, we can use a machine which offers supports for the hands, therefore making balancing easier. This can also help by having a fixed path of how the hands travel. This means that the hands will not go too much forward and then involve the spine more in the movement. Secondly, we can use different equipment like light weights or a kettlebell in keeping balance. This will help in keeping balance and allow a more free motion to occur. This is when we are trying to perform the unilateral hip hinge using a barbell. Any mobility restrictions will be amplified with both hands being fixed to the same bar, and by using a kettlebell only in one hand, we can manipulate our body position or the athlete's body position any way we want because the kettlebell is a free moving weight. Thirdly, we can perform the movement without shoes, so barefooted as described by Der Villers and Venter in 2014, as this will help the athlete stay more balanced by gripping the floor with their toes and enhance proprioception training. Another two examples of using manipulating task constraints are using the stacker stance hip hinge as being shown in this video. The rear leg is used for support and all the weight is put onto the front leg. This means that the load is being beared through the front leg and the posterior chain of the front leg is being trained. Using the back leg for support ensures more balance and the desired outcome of hinging through one lower limb is achieved. Secondly, we can perform an arm-supported single leg hip hinge as being shown in this video. In this video, the person is using a weight for counterbalance and with his left hand he is holding onto the squat rack. Manipulating this constraint is very useful because instead of the athlete using energy on balancing, this energy can be used towards reaching the task outcome of unilaterally hip hinging. Another way of using task constraints is using a band wrapped around the shoulder and the leg of the athlete. Now this is one of my athletes performing the single leg hip hinge using the band, and he's performing it very well. When we're not using this band, his knee was staying bent and he was using his spine a lot to perform the movement. The most important cue when using this form of task constraint is to tell the athlete to kick back through the heel against the band to keep the band straight. Environmental constraints. Environmental constraints include the surrounding environmental factors. These constraints play a big role in developing a skill. In this case of teaching the single leg hip hinge for the first time, what I try to do is find a very quiet room with not much action happening around the athlete. This ensures that the client can hear my feedback loud and clearly to work on quality movement rather than lifting as much weight as possible. These factors, as described by Renshaw et al., can include gravity, light, noise, and people in the gym. When teaching the single leg hip hinge, the other factor which I ensure that I am controlling is the surface upon which the movement is being performed. This is very important because if the athlete is performing it on a very soft surface like certain rubber mats, this can create a bit of an imbalancement at the foot and ankle complex and might make the movement more challenging for the athlete. So, movement variability. Movement variability states that with more experience there will be more movement variability. However, as described by Nadine in 2015 when citing Bernstein in 1967 on an experiment that he had performed, as an athlete gets more experience, they will start to show more movement variability in the strategy that they adopt to achieve a given movement task. Nonetheless, the movement outcome will still be consistent. So, let's say we're performing the single leg hip hinge in this case. Every repetition will not be performed the same, as was seen in the last video with the band around the shoulder and foot. However, even though the movement was not exactly the same, the task outcome of hip flexion and extension on one leg was still achieved. This was described by Bernstein in 1967 as being repetition without repetition. This means that each movement pattern involved a unique non-repetitive neutral and motor control. In conclusion, the constraints-based approach can be a very useful approach to teaching the unilateral hip hinge and any other weight training skill, such as the squat or bilateral hip hinge. Given all the constraints that we can control in a gym, it is very easy to use the constraints-based approach to teach many skills. However, we must also keep in mind other modes of learning and also keep in mind the person that we have in front of us. It is therefore very important to ensure that a person is screened before starting any type of training, because these can identify any strengths and weaknesses that the person have, and the constraints which we are controlling will depend on the outcome of that screening process. Thank you for watching.